I want to welcome you once again to the Upper Room. Great to be with you, and something very special today as we come to the end of the Sermon on the Mount and this series that we've been a part of. And I'm just so thrilled to bring you what Jesus tells us at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. To get into it, though, I want to talk about kind of a silly game. It's actually my favorite game called Tribond. I highly recommend it. I'm the only one in my family that likes it, so we don't play it very often. But what I like about it is the concept is they give you usually three different categories or people or times in history or whatever the case may be, and you have to figure out what they all have in common, how they're bound together, if you will. And that's just my kind of game. And I thought about it because we were talking about different games the other day with our kids. And this game, I can imagine maybe one of the questions might be, what do these three movies have in common? All right. So I'm going to give you three movies, and they're really from different eras. For example, It's a Wonderful Life would be the first one. I think it was in 1946, where Jimmy Stewart was starring in that black and white movie. And then it was sometime around 1990 that Jim Belushi, the brother of the famous John Belushi, starred in the movie Mr. Destiny. So you've got It's a Wonderful Life, Mr. Destiny, and the third is The Family Man, starring Nicolas Cage, that came out, I think, in 2000. So these are all older movies, one of them very old. And just in case you're wondering, why do you talk about movies at all? Let me tell you, I don't know if I've ever told you why I bring up movies. And the reason is this: they are modern day parables. That's what they are. They're stories. And most of them are probably not worth talking about, quite honestly. And the content is not worth bringing up. However, once in a while, you get a movie, you get a story that is significant, or a part of a story that you really want to use as an illustration. And I kind of tend to think it was what Jesus did when he told stories. Is I want to give you this illustration to help you better understand something that they could all relate to. Today, in our world of technology, it's movies that most people can relate to. So that's the reason behind this. Okay, let's get back to these three movies. It's a Wonderful Life, Mr. Destiny, and then The Family Man. If we found these three movies alongside one another in the game Tribond, here is your answer. Are you ready? They all give us a glimpse. Actually, that word glimpse is used in the third movie, The Family Man. What is a glimpse? Well, a glimpse is a momentary look into the future, usually, at the way your life is going to turn out, or the way things will turn out based on your decisions to this point. But it's just a momentary glance. It's just a peekaboo into what life may turn out to be like, or would have turned out to be like, if you had done something different in your life. Okay, all that being said, this text today, Matthew chapter 7, verses 24 through 29, is how far we'll go, 6 verses. The very end of the Sermon on the Mount is what I have always thought of as a glimpse. Now, a lot of Jesus' stories, a lot of his parables are glimpses into what life will become, but this is maybe the best. It's actually my favorite story he tells because it's so simple. I need a simple story for me to understand. And this is a glimpse into your future. And it's a glimpse into my future based on today's decisions and actions and choices. So that's kind of what this is all about, but it all summarizes the Sermon on the Mount. The philosopher Soren Kierkegaard once said this: life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. Isn't that a great line? It's so true, isn't it? We look back and we say, oh, I see what was going on, or I understand what God was doing now, but we have to live it forwards. Is there any way we can get a better idea instead of just waiting until that day when we look backwards And I think we can through the glimpse Jesus gives us in this parable. The late author, Stephen Covey, once said that he believed we should start with the end in mind. That is great insight, isn't it? If we started with the end in mind. And the illustration he used to help us understand the concept is that every pilot has to file a flight plan before he takes off. In other words, he has to have an idea, at least, and communicate it with the people in the tower and others where he is headed, where he plans on landing. And so it is that idea that I want you to keep in mind as well, that this starting with the end in mind, what Jesus is going to bring up, is really about filing a flight plan. Where are you headed? Do you have any idea? And Jesus is going to help us understand that concept. So we're wrapping up the Sermon on the Mount, the series that we have called The Lucky Ones. Discussion question right off the bat. I want to challenge you to recall one concept that you have learned from the Sermon on the Mount in this series that has stuck with you. All right, talk about that one idea. And so this passage, first of all, is about a parable. That's what it is. What is a parable? The actual word parable in the Greek is parabellin, and it means to throw down alongside. In other words, you have life, and now we're going to throw down alongside a story that will help us better understand something about life. And most often, the parable was something that was very familiar to people. That's why I began with movies. Most people are familiar with movies and the stories that come from movies. How important was this to Jesus? I want to read to you from Mark 4:33 and 34, where it says, Jesus used many similar stories and illustrations to teach the people as much as they could understand. In fact, in his public ministry, meaning when he was with the masses or with a lot of people, and not just his disciples, but other people as well, he never taught without using parables. Think about that. He never taught. He never stood before them and did not use a story to help them understand. So just to focus for just a moment on how important stories are, Reg Grant and John Reed in their book, Telling Stories to Touch the Heart, put it this way: a good story does not permit casual observation. It wraps you up in truth and recognition and won't let go. You are there in the story. Your imagination is kindled. You are involved. You interact with truth on a deep and personal level because you are in the story. And now the story is in you. Then it's over and you sit in the embrace of truth. The story is still resonating in the deepest part of you. For the moment, you're still, because it simply takes some time to get back. And once you emerge from the story, you are never the same again. That's what stories can do. Now, this story that Jesus is about to tell, you may have heard 1,000 times, but I want to challenge you to hear it for the first time all over again. This story, as I said, this story is one that resonates deep in my soul, and I think about it often. In fact, I've only attempted to write one book, and it was about this story and the meaning of this story. So you can tell why I'm so excited to be sharing this with you today. For the most part, our lives are changed by relationships and experiences. But every once in a while, like what I believe to be today, a story can change your life. It really can. I've had friends who have said, that scene, that line in that movie, that story, I think about it all the time, and it's changed my perspective. So here we go. Matthew chapter 7, starting in verse 24, Jesus says, everyone who hears these words of mine and does them is like a wise man who built his house on rock. The rain fell, the flood came, and the winds beat against that house. But it did not collapse because its foundation had been laid on rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain fell, the flood came, and the winds beat against that house, and it collapsed. It was utterly destroyed. That's the parable. That's where we begin. Now let's get into the premise or the background of this parable. Let's make sure we get the essential elements out front, and then we'll break it down even further. So the premise is this. There are two builders, all right? And they are building two houses. The builders seem to be the same kind of people. The houses, there's no differentiation between the houses. There are two different foundations, however, on which they build them. And finally, there is one storm. It is one storm. It's as though Jesus is saying these houses are not far from one another. A storm comes in at the same time, the same area, and then there is the result of all this. So you have the two builders, you have the two houses, you have the two foundations, and you have the one storm. Now, the one thing about these houses is that they're not literal houses, of course, in this story. They represent lives. They are building lives. And that's really what Jesus is going to describe as he describes the impact that a storm has on these two different lives. Now this brings us to our place. One of these builders built on a rock. Right behind me in some distance, we couldn't get closer today. Other days you can get much closer. It's what's called Independence Rock or Independence Monument. You have to go back to the early 1900s when one John Otto walked into this area and saw that rock, and he was enthralled with it. So enthralled, by the way, he would get married on June 20th, 1911 at the base of Independence Rock. And then they called that base, that area, Wedding Canyon. And so out of Wedding Canyon, this enormous rock protrudes up into the sky some 450 feet. And again, John Otto was so taken by this rock that he went to President William Taft and asked him if he could name it after our country in the sense of independence. So we won our independence, and that was so important. And President Taft gave him a flag, and Otto climbed that rock to the top and planted that flag on top of Independence Monument, Independence Rock, if you will. And for many years after that, he would climb up there on July 4th and plant that flag. And by the way, even to this day, every year on July 4th, there are a group of rock climbers who scale the side of that enormous rock and plant a flag there on Independence Day. Okay, so we wanted that in the background. It's probably the most famous rock around this area. We're in the Redlands area, the National Monument of Grand Junction, Colorado. And we wanted that behind us because the rock that Jesus talks about is not a literal rock. It's a figurative rock. But with that rock, you can be reminded that it is the wise man that chose such a place to build his house, build his life. So next, let's talk in the premise of this story about the storm. And it certainly represents the storms of life, right? Not the literal storms of rain and floods and wind, but the storms of life that are just as real. And it is those things that hit us, that strike us, and really can disable us if we're not careful. We see a picture of this in John chapter 9, starting in verse 1. As Jesus passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. I would call that a storm. I'd say that man was born into a storm. The storm is, you know what, I will never be able to see. Christy and I just stopped to get gas down the road 10 miles. And as we got back into our car, we looked to our left and a truck pulled up and a guy got out. But first he had to pull out his wheelchair and he had to put the wheels on it and put it below his driver's seat and slide onto that wheelchair before he could even get gas. That man has experienced storms that I have never experienced in my life, I guarantee. So back to our passage, John 9. As Jesus passed by, he saw a man blind from birth, And his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. It was a common belief taught by the Jewish leaders that if something went wrong in your life, it's because you sinned. And Jesus sets the record straight and says, it could be sin that brings storms into our life, but most of us experience storms that have nothing to do with sin. It's just living in a fallen world. And Jesus summarizes this man by saying, God will be glorified through what happens next. And you know what happened next. God was glorified through this man being able to see again. I take you to Psalm 102, verse 25. Long ago you laid the foundation of the earth, the psalmist writes to God, and made the heavens with your hands. They will perish, but you remain forever. They will wear out like old clothing. You will change them like a garment and discard them. He's talking about the universe, this planet, and he's saying, you put this here and it is meant to wear out. We've mentioned this before. It does not matter how careful you are with what kind of car you drive. This world will wear out when God says it's done. And part of the wearing out, if you will, is this idea that that's what storms do. Literal storms on this earth wear this place out. It erodes it. And there will be an ultimate firestorm, we're told in the New Testament, that will destroy this place. I go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 31. For the present form of this world is passing away. You can't stop it. I can't stop it. There are those who say we can, but they're actually using that to manipulate us. But that's not what this is about. The point is this: storms are a part of life. Things wear down. Bodies wear down. We all experience storms. The storm that Jesus brings up in this story is true whether you are a wise person or a fool, or whether you're rich or poor, healthy. It does not matter. We will all experience storms. And maybe the worst part about storms is they make us feel out of control, don't they? It's almost hilarious that we think we have control over our lives, but we all feel like we do. But when a storm hits, that's when we feel that we have lost control. And that may be when we're most able to depend on God. I think I've mentioned before the biosphere experiment in Oracle outside of Tucson, Arizona, 1987 to 1991, brought many, many lessons. One of my favorites is these scientists found out, living together for 3 or 4 years, that they couldn't get along. All enclosed in a small space. They couldn't get along. That's human nature. But you might remember that I mentioned one of the surprising things, because they planted trees in this biosphere, was that the trees fell down because there was no wind. That the trees these trees around here that you see, they actually need wind to strengthen them. And it is these storms that come into our life that actually strengthen us. Okay, so we've talked about how important parables are, what they're about. We've talked about the premise of this story. Now let's get to the people. I mentioned that there are 2 builders. We want to go deep into this now because that's really Jesus' point, is that there's a difference between these 2 people. In Dr. Henry Cloud's great book, Necessary Endings, he claims that he believes there are 3 kinds of people. There are wise people, there are foolish people, and there are evil people. Discussion question for you. Do you believe that Dr. Cloud is correct, that there are actually 3 kinds of people? In this story, Jesus says there are 2 kinds of people. If you do agree with him, or if you don't, I'd like for you to also give examples of people with whom you've experienced their wisdom, their foolishness, or if you've been close to somebody who was actually an evil person. Have fun. Okay, so we're going to leave evil people alone. We're not going to talk about evil people. That's one whole lesson, but we won't talk about that since Jesus, and I don't want you to miss this, he divides, it seems, humanity into the wise and the foolish. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about the wise. We're going to talk about wisdom. What is it about? How do we see it play out in our lives? And then we'll get to the foolish. And by the way, we're going to cut this lesson a little short. We're going to actually cut this entire lesson into 2 parts because I do want you to have the time to process the depth of this simple story. Okay, so we're going to start with the wise. Many people mistakenly compare wisdom and knowledge, or wisdom and intelligence, and they are really nothing alike. Scripture actually says in 1 Corinthians 8:1 that knowledge puffs up. And in other words, knowledge is not wrong, but Scripture says be careful because what tends to happen is we tend to become prideful with our knowledge, arrogant with our knowledge, and that you have seen, I'm sure, many times. Maybe you've seen it in people close to you. So knowledge and intelligence is not wisdom. In fact, wisdom is just the opposite in the sense that it does not puff up. It actually comes with humility. It is clothed in humility. That's what we read in James 3:13 and 17. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. Wisdom produces humility, just the opposite of knowledge and intelligence that can produce arrogance. Verse 17, but the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Let me go through that list again. This is what accompanies wisdom. If you're wondering, so you have it. Listen to the characteristics of the wise person that James gives us. Pure, peace-loving, considerate, full of mercy, full of good fruit, impartial, sincere. You cannot be a wise person without being genuine and sincere, is James' point. Now, people who are filled with knowledge tend to brag about their superiority, don't they? You've been around those people. But wisdom will never allow you to brag about your wisdom. In fact, the most wise people I've ever been around would never claim to be wise. You see the stark contrast between the two? And so for us to talk about wisdom means let's let go of the idea that the intelligent person is wise. We all have known people who are highly intelligent who make really poor choices in life. They just don't have wisdom. I want to start with the definition from Pastor Chuck Swindoll about wisdom, and then I'm going to give you my definition, which I think I've given to you before. But Chuck Swindoll puts it this way. Wisdom is the God-given ability to see life with rare objectivity and to handle life with rare stability. Isn't that great? It is rare to find a wise person who has objectivity given to him by God and stability given to him by God, and those insights come from God. My definition is simpler because, again, I like simple things, and that is just this. Wisdom is the ability to know how to live the way life is meant to be lived. And that comes from God. It comes from above. It's something He and He alone gives us to know how to live. You may not know everything, but you do, when you have wisdom, you do know what life is about. And you do know what the ultimate point of life is about from God's perspective. Another way I've described wisdom is the ability to make choices right now that will help you become the kind of person you believe you should become, or you believe God wants you to become. So that your choices now have long-term perspective and not just the perspective that I want to feel good right now. I want to do what feels right to me right now. So I read to you Chuck Swindoll's definition of wisdom, and I told you what my definition of wisdom is. Maybe the best thing is to go back to the story and see what Jesus' definition of wisdom is. And he defined the person who is wise, the builder who is wise, as the one who lived his words, lived the words of Jesus. That is wisdom. To live the words of Jesus. Now, it fits into the other definitions, right? I mean, if I can live out the words of Jesus, I'm going to have the long view in mind, right? I'm going to be filing a flight plan that ultimately finds me in the presence of God, welcomed home as his child. And it ultimately ends with me living a life that glorifies him. But it is his definition that the wise builder, the wise person who's building a life, will build it by living out his words. He's talking about all of his words, but he's certainly talking about everything he said in the Sermon on the Mount. Now, as a parent, I have a couple options. If I want to teach my kids how to ride a bike or how to swim, I can tirelessly talk to them about how important it is that they ride a bike or that they swim and leave it at that. Or we can actually get the kiddo on a bike, get them in the water, and they actually ride the bike, fail, but ultimately learn. They can actually swim, fail sometimes, but ultimately learn. That is a better approach. I want to compare that now to how most of us approach the life of wisdom that we say we want to live. And that is, we do an awful lot of talking about living the words of Jesus. We're really good about that. If we do know the words of Jesus, we talk a lot about what it would mean to do that. In fact, these discussion questions that I want you to spend a lot of time on is a lot of talking about that. But ultimately, what it's about, it is about actually living the words of Jesus. As a child would ride a bike, and a child would actually get in the water and swim to learn. To learn to live the life of wisdom is actually to live out the words of Jesus. So that brings us to our last discussion question for this part of the lesson, because I want you to spend a lot of time on this idea. And the last question is this: discuss specific examples of how you have begun to live the words of Jesus. Live out the ideas that Jesus presented in his teachings. Do you have specific examples of how you have actually done that? Not just talked about it, but you've actually lived that out. You've actually done what Jesus told us to do. Again, really important you understand that this is not religion. Jesus never talks about this being religion, or it never talks about it being philosophy. It is purely about the words of life that come from Jesus can be lived out, and if we're to live the life of a wise person, we will live them out. All right, enjoy the time you have together. Talk a lot, if you will, about how you are living out or struggling to live out the words of Jesus. Okay, this concludes part one of this lesson, The Glimpse. And you'll have discussion questions, as always, to talk about everything we've mentioned to this point. But please join us for part two, because that's where we'll get really practical about this idea of living as a person who is a wise builder of a life. Thanks for joining us.